20 months later, the Mafia boss answered a call. She's dead. And the child is missing. The Moretti estate was too quiet that night. The kind of quiet that made Salomone Moretti's instinct scream. He had spent 30 years building an empire on the bones of his enemies, surviving ambushes, betrayals, and the sort of violence that left permanent scars on a man's soul. Silence like this was never innocent. Silence meant the storm was already here. He stood at the window of his study, a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand, watching rain hammer against the glass. The storm outside mirrored the one he'd been carrying inside for 20 months. 20 months since she left. 20 months since Greta Milano walked out of his life with nothing but a handwritten note tucked under his bedroom door. Asterisk, I can't live in your shadow, Salomone. Don't come looking for me. And he hadn't, because he thought letting her go was the kindest thing a man like him could do. Her name still felt like absolution and damnation when he whispered it in the dark. Greta Milano, 29 years old, too young for his world, too gentle for the brutality that followed him like a shadow, too pure for a man whose hands had signed more death warrants than love letters. She had been everything he had no right to touch, and the only woman who ever made him want to be something other than what he was. Their affair had been a dangerous secret, a forbidden connection that burned too bright to survive. A fire he'd extinguished himself by letting her leave, believing she deserved a life without blood and bullet holes. He was wrong. The phone on his desk rang, shattering the silence like a gunshot. Salomone didn't move at first. His reflection stared back at him from the rain-streaked window, salt and pepper hair, tailored navy suit, the hard lines of a man who'd survived everything. Calls at midnight were never good. Midnight calls meant bodies, betrayals, or wars about to ignite. He answered anyway. Moretti. A breath. Heavy, official, carrying the weight of terrible news. A man's voice, steady but strained. Mr. Moretti, this is Detective Marco Ricci with the Metropolitan Police. I need you to come downtown. We have a situation. Salomone's grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles going white. What situation? A pause. The detective exhaled slowly, and Salomone knew he knew before the words even came. It's Greta Milano, sir. I'm sorry. She's dead. The world stopped. The rain, the thunder, his heartbeat, everything froze. Dead. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Yes, sir. We found her in her apartment about 2 hours ago. There's evidence of a struggle. And Mr. Moretti. The detective's voice dropped lower, almost reluctant. There's evidence of a child. Baby items, a nursery. But the child is missing. The glass slipped from Salomone's hand. It shattered against the hardwood floor, whiskey spreading like blood across the polished surface. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world had narrowed to 3 impossible words echoing in his skull like bullets ricocheting off stone. The child is missing. A child. His child. A child he never knew existed. Mr. Moretti? The detective's voice cut through the fog. We need you to come identify the body. And sir, we need to talk about the child. Salomone's hand trembled, the first time his hands had shaken in 20 years. His voice, when it came, was barely controlled, a razor's edge between grief and rage. I'm on my way. He hung up. For one suspended moment, Salomone Moretti stood in the wreckage of his study. The broken glass, the spilled whiskey, the rain battering the windows, and felt the foundations of his carefully controlled world crumble beneath him. Greta was dead. And somewhere out there, in the hands of people who wanted to hurt him, was a child he'd never held. A daughter or son who carried his blood and didn't know his name. He grabbed his coat and his gun. There was no force on earth that could stop him now. Not the police, not his enemies, not the ghosts of his past mistakes. He was going to find his child. And God help whoever stood in his way. The drive through the rain-soaked city felt like drowning. Salamone gripped the steering wheel of his black Mercedes so tightly his knuckles went white, the wipers struggling to keep pace with the downpour. Red and blue police lights reflected off the wet pavement ahead, turning the street into a kaleidoscope of emergency and chaos. He didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. He pulled up to the building, a modest apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place Greta would have chosen because it was far from his world, and was out of the car before the engine fully stopped. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the entrance. Uniformed officers stood guard, their faces pale and exhausted under the harsh glow of portable floodlights. One of them stepped forward, hand raised. "Sir, you can't." Salamone didn't break stride. He walked straight past the officer with the kind of authority that didn't need explanation, the kind of presence that made men step aside without thinking. The officer fell silent, looking to his partner uncertainly, but neither moved to stop him. Detective Marco Ricci was waiting just inside the lobby, a weathered man in his 50s with tired eyes and a rumpled coat soaked through from the rain. He'd worked with Salamone before, not officially, never officially, but they had an understanding. Ricci knew who Salamone Moretti was, what he was capable of. "Mr. Moretti." Ricci's voice was quiet, respectful.
"I'm sorry.
"I wouldn't have called if." "Where is she?" Salamone's voice cut through the air like a blade. Ricci nodded once and turned toward the stairwell. "Third floor. Apartment 304. They climbed in silence, their footsteps echoing against concrete walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. Salamone's heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained a mask of cold control. He'd walked into ambushes, stared down rival bosses, buried friends and enemies alike. He knew how to lock emotion away. But when Ricci pushed open the door to 304, something inside him cracked. The apartment was small, warmly decorated with soft colors and framed photographs. It smelled faintly of lavender and something sweeter, baby powder. Crime scene technicians moved quietly through the space, documenting everything, their cameras flashing like lightning. But Salamone only saw one thing. Greta. She lay on the floor near the bedroom doorway, covered by a white sheet. One hand had slipped out from beneath it, pale and delicate, her fingers curled slightly. On her wrist, still gleaming against her lifeless skin, was the silver bracelet he'd given her 2 years ago. The one engraved with a single word, Semper, always. Salamone stopped breathing. Ricci stepped beside him, his voice low. Multiple stab wounds. Defensive injuries on her hands. She fought back. "We estimate time of death around 8 hours ago." 8 hours. She'd been lying here alone, while he sat in his estate drinking whiskey and brooding over memories. The child. Salamone's voice was barely above a whisper. Ricci gestured toward a doorway to the left. Salamone forced himself to move, forced his legs to carry him across the room. He stepped into what should have been a nursery. It had been destroyed. Tiny clothes were scattered across the floor, onesies with cartoon animals, soft blankets torn from shelves. A mobile hung crooked above an empty crib, its wooden animals swaying gently as if recently disturbed. Drawers had been yanked open, their contents spilled. Diapers. Bottles. A stuffed rabbit lay face down near the closet. But no child. No baby. Nothing. Salamone's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The rage built slowly, deliberately, like a fire catching on dry wood. It started in his chest and spread through his veins, cold and burning at the same time. Someone had come into this apartment. Someone had killed the woman he loved. Someone had taken his child, a child he didn't even know existed until an hour ago, and left nothing but emptiness behind. "We found one other thing." Ricci's voice pulled him back. The detective held up an evidence bag containing a photograph. Salamone took it, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. The photo showed Greta smiling, radiant, holding an infant wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. The baby had dark hair and unmistakable eyes, his eyes. Sharp, focused, defiant even at that age. Pinned to the wall above where the photo had hung was a knife, and written on the wall, in what looked like blood, were 4 words. "She's ours now, Moretti." Salamone stared at the message, his jaw tight, his breathing controlled. And for the first time in 30 years, Detective Ricci saw something in Salamone Moretti's eyes that made him take a step back. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fear. It was the promise of absolute destruction. Salamone stood frozen in front of the wall, the evidence bag trembling in his hands, the first crack in the armor he'd worn for 3 decades. The photograph inside showed a moment he'd never been part of, a happiness he'd never witnessed. Greta sat in a rocking chair by a sunlit window, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her smile genuine and unguarded in a way he'd only seen a handful of times. She looked peaceful, safe, like she'd finally found the life she deserved away from him. In her arms, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, was an infant. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old in the photo, with a tuft of dark hair and round cheeks. But it was the eyes that stopped Salamone's heart. Wide, alert, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that didn't belong on such a small face. His eyes. The same sharp, watchful gaze he saw in the mirror every morning. The same expression he wore when sizing up threats, measuring opponents, calculating survival. His daughter had inherited more than just his blood. She had inherited his fight. How old? Salamone's voice came out rougher than he intended, barely controlled. Ricci consulted his notes. Based on what we found, birth certificate, medical records, the child is approximately 18 months old. Her name is Alina. Alina Milano. Alina. The name settled into his chest like a weight he'd carry forever. Salamone's gaze shifted from the photograph to the wall behind where it had hung. The knife was still embedded there, driven deep into the plaster with enough force to crack the paint around it. It was a message in itself, not just pinned but stabbed into the wall. Violence as punctuation. And beneath it, smeared in what forensics had confirmed was Greta's blood, were the words that made everything clear. "She's ours now, Moretti." Not "we have her." Not "pay or she dies." Not even a ransom demand or territory negotiation. Ours. Possessive. Personal. A declaration of ownership meant to wound him in ways bullets never could. Salamone's hands shook as he lowered the evidence bag, his fingers curling into fists. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think through the rage threatening to consume him. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. Someone had known about Greta, known about Alina, known exactly where to find them and exactly when to strike. Someone had been watching, waiting. "This wasn't about her," Salamone said quietly, his voice like gravel. "This was about me." Ricci nodded grimly. "That's our assessment too. Whoever did this wanted you to know. They wanted you to see this." He gestured to the blood-written message. "They could have just taken the child. But they stayed. They took the time to leave this. Because they want me to suffer." Salamone's jaw tightened. "They want me to know my daughter is alive and in their hands. They want me to imagine what they might do to her." "Do you have any idea who?" "Everyone." The word came out sharp, final. Salamone turned away from the wall, his mind already racing through possibilities, enemies, rivals. "I've made a career out of making enemies, detective. The list of people who'd want to hurt me is longer than your case files." But even as he said it, something nagged at him. The specificity of this. The knowledge of Greta's location, Alina's existence. This wasn't just any enemy. This was someone close. Someone who'd been patient enough to wait 20 months. Someone who knew his weaknesses better than he knew them himself. "We'll need you to make a list," Ricci said. "Anyone with motive means opportunity. I'll handle it." "Mr. Moretti, This is a police investigation. Salamone turned, and the look in his eyes made Ricci's words die in his throat. It was the look of a man who'd already decided that laws, procedures, and protocols no longer applied. A man who'd crossed a line he could never uncross. "You do your job, detective. I'll do mine." Salamone's voice was ice and iron. "But understand this. Whoever took my daughter won't make it to a courtroom. They won't make it to a cell. They'll be lucky if I leave enough of them to identify." He turned back to the photograph one last time, memorizing every detail. Greta's smile, Alina's eyes, the yellow blanket, the sunlight streaming through the window of a life he'd never been allowed to share. And then he walked out of the apartment, leaving Ricci standing alone in the ransacked nursery, surrounded by evidence of a crime that had just become personal in ways the law could never address. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark. Salamone stood on the sidewalk, the photograph burned into his memory, the message carved into his soul. "She's ours now, Moretti." "Not for long," he whispered to the night. Then he got into his car and drove toward war. Salamone returned to the apartment 3 hours later, after the crime scene techs had finished, and the body had been removed. Ricci had protested, citing protocol and chain of custody, but one look from Salamone had settled the matter. The detective left him a key and a warning about not disturbing evidence, then disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Now Salamone stood alone in the silent apartment, surrounded by the ghost of a life he'd never known. The lavender scent was stronger without the antiseptic smell of the forensics team, and it made his chest ache. He could picture Greta here, moving through these rooms, humming softly while she folded tiny clothes, rocking Alina to sleep in the nursery. He needed answers. Needed to understand how this had happened, who had known, what he'd missed. He started in the bedroom, methodical and thorough the way he'd learned to search safe houses and rival territories decades ago. Closet first, her clothes still hung neatly, modest dresses and comfortable sweaters. The dresser yielded baby albums he couldn't bring himself to open yet, vaccination records, birth certificate. Under the bed, storage boxes filled with maternity clothes and pregnancy books. But nothing that explained who had found them. Nothing that pointed to the enemy. Salamone sat on the edge of the bed, frustration mounting. Then he noticed it, a slight unevenness in the hardwood floor near the nightstand, barely visible unless you were looking for it. He knelt, running his fingers along the boards until he found the loose section. It lifted easily, as if it had been opened many times before. Hidden in the shallow space beneath was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft from handling. Salamone's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The leather was warm brown, small enough to fit in Greta's hands, and when he opened it, her handwriting filled the first page. Neat, careful, achingly familiar. March 15th. I took the test this morning. Positive. I'm pregnant with Salamone's child. The words hit him like bullets. He'd known, intellectually, that Alina was his daughter. But seeing it written in Greta's hand, seeing the date, barely 2 weeks after she'd left him, made it devastatingly real. He turned the page. I can't tell him. His world is violence and blood, and I won't bring a baby into that. I won't let our child grow up dodging bullets and living in fear. This is my choice. Mine alone. Salamone's throat tightened. He kept reading, page after page, watching Greta's pregnancy unfold in her own words. Her morning sickness. Her first ultrasound. The moment she learned she was having a girl. Her fears, her hopes, her determination to give their daughter a normal life. June 3rd. I felt her kick today. Strong, insistent, like she's already fighting. Like her father. Then came the birth entries, raw and beautiful. The exhaustion, the overwhelming love, the terror of being responsible for something so small and perfect. September 12th. Alina smiled at me today. A real smile, not gas. She has his eyes, but when she smiles, she's all light. Everything good I wanted to protect. Salamoni's vision blurred. He wiped at his eyes impatiently, but the tears kept coming. November 28th. Her first word. I've been teaching her mama for weeks, but this morning she looked right at the photograph I keep hidden in my drawer, the one of Salamoni I couldn't make myself throw away, and she said, "Papa."
Clear as day.
My heart broke and soared at the same time. The entries continued. Alina's first steps. Her stubborn personality. The way she scowled when she didn't get her way, exactly like Salamoni. Greta's joy mixed with loneliness, her love for their daughter mixed with grief for the man she'd left behind. Then, 3 weeks ago, the tone changed. I think someone's watching me. A black car parked across the street for 3 days. Different drivers, but the same car. I'm probably being paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling. Salamoni's hands clenched around the journal. I saw him again today. The man from the black car. He was in the grocery store, pretending to shop, but his eyes followed me. Followed Alina. I need to leave. I need to take her somewhere safe.
I'm scared, Salamoni.
I'm so scared. I thought leaving you would keep her safe, but what if I was wrong? What if they found us because of you, and you're not here to protect us? The final entry was dated yesterday, written in shaky handwriting, so different from her usual careful script. They're outside. They knocked on the door an hour ago, but I didn't answer. Alina is sleeping. She doesn't know anything is wrong. If something happens to me, if you're reading this somehow, please protect our daughter. Her name is Alina.
She has your eyes.
She's stubborn and fierce and perfect. She says Papa when she sees your photograph. I never told her about you, but somehow she knows. Please find her.
Please keep her safe.
I'm sorry I didn't trust you with this. I'm sorry I thought I could do it alone. I love you. I never stopped. Always. The journal slipped from Salamoni's hands and hit the floor. He sat there on the bedroom floor of the woman he loved, surrounded by the evidence of a life he'd been excluded from, and for the first time in 30 years, Salamoni Moretti broke. Tears streamed down his face, silent and relentless, carving paths through decades of carefully maintained control. Greta had been terrified. Their daughter had said his name, and he hadn't been there. He'd failed them both. But he wouldn't fail Alina again. Dawn was breaking over the Moretti estate when Salamoni returned, Greta's journal tucked inside his coat like a talisman. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The only thing keeping him moving was the cold, focused rage that had settled into his bones during the drive back. He went straight to the war room, a windowless study in the basement where he'd planned operations, negotiated treaties, and ordered executions for the better part of 3 decades. By the time he arrived, his inner circle was already assembled. He'd sent the call out an hour ago. Everyone in the room by 6, no exceptions, no questions. 6 men sat around the heavy oak table, their faces ranging from confused to concerned. These were the people Salamoni trusted with his life, the ones who'd been with him through wars and consolidations, the ones who knew where the bodies were buried because they'd helped dig the graves. His consigliere, Marco Santoro, sat at the head of the table opposite where Salamoni would stand. Marco was 62, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a lawyer by training and a strategist by nature. He'd been Salamoni's right hand for 15 years. Beside him sat Enzo, head of security. Then Carlo, who ran the financial operations. Tommaso, who handled enforcement. Luca, intelligence. And finally, Victor, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who'd stood beside him in firefights and negotiations, who'd saved his life twice and never once questioned an order. Salamoni entered without preamble and remained standing, his hands flat on the table. The room went silent. 20 months ago, I had an affair with a woman named Greta Milano. His voice was controlled, but something in it made every man in the room sit up straighter. She left me. I let her go. Last night I learned why. She was pregnant. With my daughter. The shock rippled through the room. Marco's eyes widened fractionally. Victor leaned forward. No one spoke. Last night, Greta was murdered in her apartment, stabbed multiple times. And my daughter, Alina, 18 months old, was taken. Salomone's knuckles went white against the dark wood.
Someone knew about them.
Someone had been watching them, and someone left me a message written in Greta's blood. She's ours now, Moretti. Cristo. Enzo breathed. I need to know who. Salomone's gaze swept the table, landing on each man in turn. I need names, locations, connections. Someone in this city knew about Greta and my daughter when even I didn't. Someone watched them for weeks. Someone planned this. Marco cleared his throat, his expression troubled. Salomone, there's something you should know. Every eye turned to the consigliera. Marco shifted uncomfortably, a rare display of unease from a man who'd negotiated with cartel bosses and federal prosecutors without breaking a sweat. The Castellanos have been making moves. Quietly. Testing our borders, talking to our suppliers, reaching out to some of our smaller partners. Salomone's eyes narrowed. The Castellanos? We've had peace with them for 5 years. Had. Marco emphasized. 6 months ago, Don Castellano died. His son Vitor took over. He's young, ambitious, and from what our sources say, he doesn't respect the old agreements. He wants to expand, and our territory is the most valuable prize. We've been monitoring them, Luca added, his voice tight. But they went dark about 48 hours ago. Radio silence. No meetings, no movements we could track. It was unusual. 48 hours. Right before Greta was killed. Salomone's jaw tightened. What else? Marco exchanged a glance with Luca, then continued. One of our informants, the one who works the docks near the Castellano operations, reported seeing a black SUV leaving their compound 3 nights ago. Late, around 2 a.m. He didn't think much of it at the time, but... Salomone's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. But he saw the same SUV parked 2 blocks from an address in the Marina district yesterday morning. He took note of the location because it seemed out of place for Castellano business. Marco pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Salomone didn't need to open it. He knew what address it would show. Greta's apartment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the barely audible hum of the ventilation system. Salomone stood perfectly still, his mind working through the implications with brutal efficiency. The Castellanos wanted his territory. They'd discovered his weakness, a daughter he didn't know existed. They'd killed Greta to send a message and taken Alina as leverage. They'd made the worst mistake of their lives. When Salomone finally spoke, his voice was so cold that even Victor, who'd seen him at his most ruthless, felt a chill run down his spine. Find them. Find every Castellano soldier, every associate, every business they own, every place they might hide. I want surveillance on their compound, their families, their mistresses. I want to know what they eat for breakfast and where they sleep at night. He paused, his eyes like chips of ice. And I want Vitor Castellano's location within the next 6 hours. Salomone, Marco said carefully, if we move against them openly, it could start a war that. The war already started. Salomone's voice cut through the room like a blade. They just don't know they've already lost. He looked around the table one final time, meeting each man's eyes. Find my daughter, and find the people who took her. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who we have to burn. I don't care if we have to tear this entire city apart brick by brick. His hands curled into fists. They touched what's mine. They killed the mother of my child. And now they're going to learn exactly why people fear the name Moretti. No one in the room doubted he meant every word. The evidence came together like pieces of a nightmare Salomone hadn't wanted to see. Luca had been thorough, pulling security footage from traffic cameras near Greta's apartment, cross-referencing phone records, tracing financial transactions through shell companies and offshore accounts. By noon, patterns emerged that made Salamoni's blood run cold. A burner phone, purchased 4 months ago, with calls made to known Castellano numbers. Wire transfers, small enough to avoid immediate attention but consistent. Weekly payments totaling nearly $200,000 over 6 months. And security footage from the parking garage of Greta's building, time-stamped 2 weeks ago, showing a familiar figure entering a black SUV with Castellano plates, Victor. Salamoni stared at the grainy image on the monitor in his study, his trusted lieutenant's profile unmistakable even in the low-quality footage. Victor, who'd stood beside him in firefights. Victor, who'd been best man at his wedding 20 years ago. Victor, who knew every secret, every weakness, every detail of Salamoni's life. Victor, who was the only person outside this room who'd known about Greta. Salamoni had mentioned her once, 3 years ago, during a late night when too much whiskey had loosened his tongue. A confession about a woman who'd made him feel human again. He'd never said her name, never given details, but Victor was smart. Victor paid attention. And Victor, apparently, had been watching ever since. Where is he? Salamoni's voice was utterly flat. Marco checked his phone. Enzo's bringing him in now. He doesn't know we know. 20 minutes later, Victor walked into the study with his usual confident stride, nodding to the men assembled around the table. Boss, you called for. He stopped when he saw Salamoni's face. Sit down, Victor. It wasn't a request. Victor's eyes darted around the room, reading the tension, the hard stares from men who'd been his brothers. His hand drifted toward his jacket. Don't. Enzo had moved behind him, gun already drawn. Hands where we can see them. Victor slowly raised his hands, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation to something like resignation. He sat in the chair Marco pulled out, directly across from Salamoni. I can explain. Explain? Salamoni's voice was so quiet it was almost gentle, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Explain how you sold out the location of my daughter's mother to the Castellanos? Explain how you helped them murder an innocent woman? Explain how you're responsible for my child being in the hands of animals. He slid the printed evidence across the table, phone records, financial statements, security footage, and watched Victor's face drain of color. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Victor said, his voice cracking. They said they just wanted leverage, just wanted to pressure you into negotiating territory. They said no one would get hurt. She's dead, Victor. Salamoni leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. Greta Milano is dead. Stabbed 17 times in her own apartment while my daughter slept in the next room. And now Alina is gone, and you're going to tell me you thought no one would get hurt? Victor's hands trembled. Salamoni, please, I didn't know they'd. How long? The question cut through Victor's pleading like a scalpel. How long have you been working for them? 8 months, Victor whispered. Vitor approached me after his father died. Offered me a position in their organization if I helped them take over your territory. Said the old ways were dying, that you were getting soft, that it was time for new leadership. And you believed him. I believed the money. Victor's voice turned bitter. 15 years, Salamoni. 15 years I've stood beside you, taken bullets for you, and what do I have to show for it? You live in a mansion while I rent an apartment. You drive luxury cars while I... Salamoni moved so fast Victor didn't see it coming. One moment he was sitting. The next he had Victor by the throat, slamming him back against the chair with enough force to crack the wood. You had brotherhood, Salamoni snarled, his face inches from Victor's. You had loyalty. You had trust. And you traded it all for money and a seat at a table with men who would have killed you the moment you were no longer useful. Victor gasped for air, clawing at Salamoni's grip. Please. Salamoni released him, and Victor slumped forward, coughing. For a long moment, the only sound was Victor's ragged breathing. Where is she? Salamone asked quietly. Where is my daughter? I don't know, I swear. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Victor screamed as the bullet shattered his kneecap, blood spreading across the expensive carpet.
Where is she?
The factory, Victor sobbed, clutching his leg. The old factory on the waterfront, the one we used for shipping before the Castellanos took it over. Vitor is keeping her there, waiting to negotiate terms. He wants 50% of your territory and immunity from retaliation. He thinks you'll agree to anything to get her back. How many men? 8, maybe 10 guarding the location. But Salamone, please. Victor reached out with a blood-slicked hand. We were brothers. We were family. Please, I made a mistake. I can fix this. Salamone looked down at the man who'd betrayed him, who'd sold out an innocent woman and endangered his daughter for money and ambition, and felt absolutely nothing. We were family, he agreed softly. And you killed it. He nodded to Enzo. Make it clean. And make sure the Castellanos know what happens to traitors. Victor's screams followed Salamone out of the room, but he didn't look back. He had a daughter to find, and every second wasted was another second Alina spent in enemy hands. The betrayal would haunt him later. Right now, he had a war to finish. The war room transformed into a command center within an hour. Maps of the waterfront district covered the table, marked with red circles indicating Castellano positions, blue lines showing entry points, and black X's where guards had been spotted. Satellite imagery from a contact in the state police showed the abandoned factory in stark detail, a 3-story industrial complex surrounded by chain-link fencing and overlooked by rusted water towers. Salamone stood at the head of the table, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, studying the layout with the focus of a general planning an invasion. Around him, 12 men checked weapons, reviewed blueprints, and coordinated timing. These weren't all his people. Some were favors being called in from old allies who owed him blood debts. Others were specialists, a former special forces operator who owed Salamone his life, a demolitions expert who'd once worked for the Morettas, a sniper who asked no questions as long as the money was right. Marco stood beside him, tablet in hand, coordinating intelligence in real time. Thermal imaging confirms at least 9 heat signatures inside the factory. 8 clustered on the ground floor, likely guards. 1 isolated signal on the second floor, northeast corner. Salamone's jaw tightened. The child, most likely. The room matches what Victor described, a former supervisor's office. Only 1 entry point, easy to defend. Marco zoomed in on the blueprint. They're keeping her contained and controllable. How do we know she's even alive? The question came from Tommaso, who was checking the magazine on his pistol. It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one wanted to ask. Salamone's hands clenched on the edge of the table. We don't. The admission hung in the air like smoke. For all Victor's information, for all their intelligence gathering, they had no proof Alina was still breathing. The Castellanos could have killed her already, could be using her body as bait for a trap, could be waiting to negotiate only to reveal they had nothing left to negotiate with. Then we go in assuming she's alive, Marco said quietly. Because if we assume otherwise, we've already lost. Salamone nodded, grateful for his consigliera's steadiness, when his own composure felt paper-thin. Entry points. What do we have? The former Special Forces operator, a man called Dante who moved with deadly efficiency, stepped forward. 3 options. Front entrance, heavily monitored. Reinforced door. Suicide approach. Loading dock on the east side. Less secure but exposed. They'll see us coming. Or the drainage access on the north side that connects to the old sewer system. Tight quarters, but it puts us inside their perimeter undetected. The sewers, Salamone decided immediately. We split into 2 teams. First team through the drainage access, neutralize ground floor guards quietly. Second team holds at the loading dock as backup and cuts off any escape routes. Once ground floor is secure, I go up for Alina. You, Enzo frowned. Salamone, with respect, you should coordinate from. I'm getting my daughter. The words came out flat, absolute. I'm not sending anyone else up those stairs.
She doesn't know any of you.
She's going to be terrified. When we find her, she needs to see. He paused, something raw flickering across his face. She needs to see her father. No one argued. They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail. Guard rotations, radio frequencies, extraction routes, contingency plans if things went wrong. Salamone forced himself to think tactically, to plan for variables and unexpected complications, but underneath the strategy, fear was eating him alive. What if they'd hurt her? What if Alina was crying right now, alone in a dark room, wondering why no one came? What if she was terrified of the men guarding her, of the unfamiliar voices and rough hands? Victor had said the Castellanos wanted leverage, that they planned to negotiate, but Vitor was young and reckless. What if he'd lost patience? What if he'd decided a dead child sent just as strong a message? Salamone's hands trembled as he strapped on his shoulder holster. He'd faced death 100 times without hesitation, walked into ambushes knowing he might not walk out, but this was different. This wasn't his life at stake. This was Alina's. A child who'd existed for 18 months without him, who said Papa to a photograph, who had his eyes and Greta's smile, and deserved so much better than the violence he was about to bring to her doorstep. Boss. Marco appeared beside him, voice low. We're ready. Teams are in position. Salamone checked his weapon one final time. A Beretta 92, reliable and familiar. The same gun he'd carried for 20 years. He looked around the room at the assembled men, warriors and killers all, gathered for one purpose. Rules of engagement, he said clearly. Any Castellano soldier who surrenders gets zip-tied and left for the police. Anyone who fights back dies. But if anyone has hurt my daughter, I want them alive. His voice dropped to something darker. I'll handle them personally. The men nodded, understanding perfectly. Some fates were worse than bullets. Salamone pulled on his tactical vest and headed for the door. The factory was 20 minutes away. In less than an hour, this would be over, one way or another. He thought of Greta's journal entry, her final words. Asterisk, please find her. Please keep her safe. I'm coming, Alina, he whispered to the night. Papa's coming. The assault began at 2:47 a.m., when the city was at its darkest and the Castellano guards at their most complacent. Salamone led the first team through the drainage tunnel, cold water soaking through his boots, the smell of rust and decay thick in the confined space. They moved in absolute silence, hand signals only, weapons raised. They emerged inside the factory's basement, a cavernous space filled with abandoned machinery and decades of industrial debris. Above them, footsteps echoed, guards making rounds, unaware death had already entered their stronghold. The first guard died without a sound, Dante's blade across his throat before he could reach for his radio. The second managed half a shout before Enzo's suppressed pistol put 2 rounds in his chest. Within 4 minutes, the ground floor was clear, 6 Castellano soldiers zip-tied or dead, and Salamone was moving toward the stairs. His heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed, each step bringing him closer to the second floor, closer to Alina. Tommaso and Dante flanked him, weapons sweeping corners, but Salamone barely registered their presence. Every sense was focused on the northeast corner, on the room where his daughter waited. They found it at the end of a long corridor, a reinforced door with a deadbolt, 2 guards posted outside. The guards saw them and reached for their weapons. They didn't make it. Salamone shot them both, center mass, professional and efficient, and they dropped like puppets with cut strings. He stood outside the door, his hand on the deadbolt, and for one suspended moment, He couldn't breathe. What if she was hurt? What if she was? He threw the bolt and pushed the door open. The room was small, lit by a single bare bulb. A camping cot sat against one wall, a few toys scattered on the floor, and in the corner, sitting on a thin blanket, was a little girl. Alina. She was so small, impossibly small, with dark curls matted from crying and wide eyes red-rimmed with tears. She wore pink pajamas and clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, the same worn rabbit from Greta's apartment, from the journal entries Salamone had memorized. When the door opened, she flinched back, another sob building in her throat. But then she saw him. Salamone froze in the doorway, and their eyes met, his and hers, identical, the same sharp intensity that had stared back at him from mirrors his entire life. For a heartbeat, the world contracted to just this moment, this connection, this recognition that bypassed words and went straight to blood. Alina stopped crying. Salamone slowly lowered his weapon, handing it back to Dante without looking. He took one careful step into the room, then another, moving the way he'd approach a frightened animal, slow, non-threatening, hands visible. When he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way it hadn't been since Greta left, soft and careful and utterly unlike the man who just killed his way through a building. "Alina," he said quietly. "My name is Salamone. I'm your papa." He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." Alina stared at him, her little hands gripping the stuffed rabbit. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Papa?" The word destroyed him. Salamone's vision blurred, and he nodded, not trusting his voice. Alina looked at him for another long moment, studying his face with that intense gaze she'd inherited from him. Then she dropped the rabbit and reached out with both arms, the universal gesture of a child asking to be held. Salamone crossed the distance in 2 strides and lifted her into his arms. She was so light, so fragile, her small body fitting against his chest like she'd always belonged there. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she buried her face in his shoulder, and Salamone held her like she was made of glass and starlight. "I've got you," he whispered into her dark curls. "Papa's got you. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again." Behind him, Dante cleared his throat. "Boss, we need to. Where's Vittor Castellano?" Salamone's voice was still gentle for Alina's sake, but underneath ran steel and ice. "3rd floor. Marco's team has him cornered in the offices." Salamone stood, Alina still in his arms. She didn't let go, clinging to him with surprising strength. He carried her out of the room, down the corridor, and into a cleared office where Tommaso waited. "Stay with her. Anyone comes near her, you kill them." Tommaso nodded, understanding perfectly. Salamone tried to set Alina down, but she whimpered and tightened her grip. He looked into her eyes, his eyes, and saw the fear there, the trauma of 2 days in captivity with strangers. "I have to go for just a moment, Tesoro. But I'm coming right back. I promise." "Papa," she whispered again, uncertain. "I promise." He kissed her forehead, gently unwrapped her arms, and handed her to Tommaso. She started to cry again, reaching for him, and it took everything Salamone had to turn away. He found Vittor Castellano on the 3rd floor, surrounded by 4 of Salamone's men, bleeding from a shoulder wound and backed against a wall. The young Don was maybe 30, arrogant even in defeat, his expensive suit torn and dirty. "Moretti," Vittor spat. "You want to negotiate? I'll give you back the brat fur." Salamone shot him in the knee. Vittor screamed and collapsed. "You don't get to call her that," Salamone said quietly, standing over him. "You don't get to negotiate. You killed the mother of my child. You terrorized an innocent woman. You kidnapped my daughter." He crouched down, his voice dropping to something terrible. "And now you're going to pay for every moment of fear you put her through." What happened next in that third-floor office would become legend in the underworld. A warning of what happened when you touched Salamone Moretti's family. Vittor Castellano's screams echoed through the empty factory, but no one came to help him. By the time Salamone finished, the young Don was begging for death. Salamone gave it to him. 3 weeks later, the Moretti estate was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that came with soft footsteps in the hallway and the occasional sound of a child's laughter. Salamone sat in the newly built nursery, painted soft yellow like the blanket in Greta's photograph, furnished with everything an 18-month-old could need. Alina slept in his arms, her dark curls soft against his chest, her stuffed rabbit tucked beside her, completely at peace for the first time since he'd found her. Greta's journal lay open on the table beside him, her handwriting visible in the lamplight. Salamone looked down at their daughter, his daughter, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. "I found her, Greta," he whispered to the memory of the woman he'd loved. "And I swear to you, I'll protect her. I'll be there for her. I'll be the father she deserves, the father I should have been from the start." He pressed a kiss to Alina's forehead. "I'll honor your sacrifice. I'll make sure she knows she was loved. By you. By me." Alina stirred in her sleep, her small hand gripping his shirt, and Salamone held her closer. For the first time in 20 months, the silence didn't make him uneasy. It didn't signal danger or betrayal or loss. It meant safety. It meant peace. It meant his daughter was home, sleeping soundly, protected by walls and guards and a father who would burn the world before he let anything touch her. Outside, rain began to fall again, streaking the windows of the nursery. But inside, where Salamone Moretti sat with his daughter in his arms, everything was warm and quiet and safe. Finally, he was where he belonged.